Well. It's This Week in Cannabis Live. I'm Jay Rosenthal. That's Mark Hauser from Cannabis Musings. And on the other side of me is Jeremy Burke, my co-founder and our editor-in-chief here at Cultivated. We had stuff to talk about, and it was quasi what we're going to talk about, but Trulieve moved faster, and I guess the New York Stock Exchange moved faster than we did this week. Mark, Trulieve on the medical side is going to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. I think I have that right. I saw a lot of whereases in this document, but that's very dense. Tell us in a less dense way what's going on.
Well, yeah, they got New York Stock Exchange approval to list their stock for trading, or some of their stock for trading. This was, it was inevitable. As soon as we talked about this on the stream, I talked about it in my musings. Once we saw medical move to Schedule 3, it made sense for companies that had significant medical operations that were also public to try to do this. And so Trulieve, earlier this week, they basically mostly spun off their, let's call it mixed license assets that have adult use components to them, to sort of isolate out within Trulieve and leave there the medical only, which is, for the most part, call it Florida and Pennsylvania. Though they did, it was based, the documents that came out earlier this week said that it was, basically the harvest assets is kind of how they generally defined it. It wasn't too specific in the documents that were posted, but basically what they did was they sold them off or spun them out into a new entity that is, and then they sold 10% of it to somebody for $14 million, which I guess would imply about $140 million ish or valuation to those assets. Trulieve has kind of a call on those assets to pull them back and bring that back into the fold if the New York Stock Exchange allows adult use assets to also be within them and still remain listed. So it's, which is savvy in what you'd expect. Which then also suggests that, at least at the moment, the New York Stock Exchange is not comfortable yet with adult use assets. The NASDAQ, at least publicly, remains to be seen. The last I've heard is that they're thinking about it, but I've not heard anything beyond that. Maybe we'll see in the next few days if somebody else is going to pull that off with mixed use assets. But look, overall, I think it's great. My dog thinks it's great. She's barking out of joy. I think it's great for the industry. It's a nice feather in the cap for Trulieve, who made a big bet on Florida adult use and lost that bet, but in the long run, turned that into a win. And won this battle. And, the big question, there's three open questions that I have, and then I'll stop talking, is one, what happens if medical fails in court? That would be a weird result. Two is that this doesn't really mean, I don't think, at least for the New York Stock Exchange, if they're not willing to list adult use assets, there's not a ton of companies that can really effectively take advantage of this, that have significant medical only presences to really pull this off. There's some, but it's not everybody is going to all of a sudden be able to shift over. And third is, and I wrote about this at the beginning of the week, is, the next big step is convincing institutional investors on a long-term basis that this industry is investable. I'm not saying that it isn't, but it's not AI. So it's not, so for better and for worse. So anyway,
I appreciate all of that, Jeremy. I want to go to you because this comes on the heels of a couple things. One, we saw Trulieve sort of hinted at it when they separated the two companies, and then they announced that they were going to be listing on the New York Stock Exchange. We saw Verano also do a reverse stock split in advance of something like this. Curaleaf as well.
Yep.
Like, and to Mark's last point, sort of institutional investors, but we also saw on the retail investor side, Robinhood started listing some of these companies first as, I guess, C only, and then as investable. Like, these are these independent points to consider, or is there a through line through these that people know more than we do about what the stock exchanges in New York might be doing vis-a-vis the cannabis industry?
Look, I did reach out to the New York Stock Exchange this morning to see if they wanted to talk about it. They haven't gotten back to me, so I can only speculate. Right, they haven't got back to me yet. I can only speculate, Jay, but I think the way you're reading the tea leaves is the way to read the tea leaves, right? I think Robinhood, it's a smart company. They're going to only add stocks that, both OTC, they want more OTC stocks, but also that there is going to be trading volume for, that there is going to be interest for. And look, publicly traded cannabis companies, like they're all making moves. Verano, Curaleaf, the reverse splits are in effort to list on major domestic exchanges, New York Stock Exchange, or potentially the NASDAQ, right? And so I think the tea leaves are the tea leaves. Like I'm reading them. That has no bearing on what the output of the June 29th DEA hearing will be, right? Like that's still a question mark. We don't know. But companies are preparing. These are big signals, and they should be signals to the entire industry, right? Yeah. That this is coming, and it's not a done deal, but there's a lot of momentum. Yeah, more than we've seen in a long time.
Jeremy, you were covering the industry way back when, in the Canadian side. Yeah. I live here when it was happening. On the one hand, there were big advantages of being first-ish to being a publicly listed company available for retail investors to get into the Canopy, Aurora, some of the older, bigger companies that raised billions of dollars being publicly traded. And they didn't really have companies behind them yet. Like there was no financials to look at. Like it was all promise. Whereas, so in the one respect, like it's great to be listed first for sure. And now Trulieve has a much longer track record than the Canopies of the world did, being a full-fledged company in cannabis. And I wonder if it's like, is there a parallel, or is it not the same thing because these companies actually have a track record you look at, or does it not matter because people want to invest in weed companies because it's fun?
Column A, column B, right? Obviously, there is going to be like a Reddit, weed stocks, Wall Street bets thing going on here. It's cannabis, and and it's exciting to retail investors, and it's finally happening. But two, I want to give credit to the MSOs, right? They've operated under a very difficult, capital constrained, regulatorily constrained, if that's a word, environment for a long time. And they do have real businesses, right? And I think, whether you want to poke holes in their balance sheet or their strategy, which, we can and we do all the time, the fact of the matter is that without 280E, with access to major domestic exchanges and all the liquidity that comes with that, potentially, if this DEA hearing goes the right way, being institutional investment grade companies, like that will be a sea change. And Jay, to your point, layering that on top of businesses that have operated without any of that in the first place is going to be a good thing. I think, some of them will be acquisition targets, right, for other cannabis companies or for, companies outside of the space. And I think that'll be part of it. But, I would predict that 2 or 3 of these emerge pretty strongly over the next year if the DA hearing goes well. And, some of that could be tangled up in court fights. Just the last thing I'll say on that, it's kind of funny. As you're talking, I pulled up Canopy Growth stock chart, and it was a high of $475 per share in 2018. It is now $1 per share. So, you don't know, right? But it's interesting to say the least.
You can tell the people in Smith Falls all about it because they know it all well. Mark, this is a question for you because I think it's actually another thing to consider of your 3. It's from El Guapo Tron 4000 on YouTube. What a real mind fuck. Sorry. What happens if Trulieve this next week? The ALJ hearing goes sideways, and then Florida goes adult use in 2028.
That would be hilarious, is actually what the answer is to that. I would love that. I would eat that kind of stuff up because, there's so many weird, sort of like what ifs at this point. And that's what's so great about this and what makes it intellectually interesting. There's 2 other things I want to point out here, both of which are to throw because my job is to be a skunk at the picnic. I want to, spray a little here. Is one, is that this is great for retail investors. I mean, you could see the stocks traded up.
Yeah.
Cannabis stocks generally don't tie to reality anyway. But it doesn't. Listing in and of itself doesn't necessarily guarantee money. I mean, we saw this with a couple of U.S. operators being restructuring an uplist on the TSX. It didn't result in more money coming into the company, even though the TSX has better liquidity from a trading perspective than the CSE. So let's hope that this can then, spin into, really pulling in new money. The other thing is that adult use being moved to Schedule 3 doesn't guarantee a listing. Here's the nuance of why. And I'm going to think about this a little more. I need to write about this and get this out. But the order that listed, that rescheduled medical, comes with this whole mechanism, the DEA mechanism to get DEA registered and you sell and buy. That mechanism gets the lawyers comfortable that if you are compliant with this DEA mechanism, you are legal. You are no longer violating the Controlled Substances Act. And and the exchange said, even though the DEA process isn't set up yet, we're good enough because we know that this is going to be in place, and there's this sort of savings clause that if you've applied, you are kosher. And so that gives the law firms enough comfort to issue a legal opinion to the stock exchange. It remains to be seen if adult use also gets rescheduled to Schedule 3, if the same DEA process and licensing is set up. Right. That's the key. If that isn't put in place when it moves to Schedule 3, then I think the argument for the stock exchanges gets a lot harder. And I think, most people are sort of ignoring that problem. But the trick there too, the weird thing would be is that if the Schedule 3 order does include this mechanism, then that also arguably makes adult use completely legal, which would be an even weirder result, that would result in cannabis being federally legal, other than the FDA problem. But so again, just you talk about mindfuck, there's a mindfuck for you.
Jeremy.
Oh, I was just going to add to that. I mean, there is still also the issue of custodians and clearinghouses. This is going to take a long time to unravel, and each firm is going to make its own choices whether they want to do business with the industry, right? Schedule 3 is not legalization; it's not carte blanche to do that. I mean, even my own financial advisor based in Canada, won't invest money into cannabis stocks, right? This is RBC in Canada. And so look, this is going to take a long time to unravel. And I think that I want to make that point too, that not unbridled optimism, not necessarily a skunk, but not unbridled either.
But this is still a good thing. I mean, let's be all, for all this shit that we're, not shit, but all this sort of what ifs. I mean, this is still a success for the industry.
Mm-hmm. I wonder.
Totally.
Well, let's take the next logical step. Regardless of what happens down the road, there are, let's call them truly competitors or compatriots thinking about the same thing, right? Like, how do we disentangle our medical from our adult use? How do we put something in there that says we can take it back if these certain things happen? Like someone just, I hesitate to put comments from YouTube on the show, but this one is interesting. Rhythm may be a recipient of medical assets from GTI if the NASDAQ allows it. We'll see.
Smart.
Right. So this is, I don't know if this is what Ben Kovler had in mind. I don't think it was, but it might be an interesting avenue. I mean, who knows, right? Like that.
Yeah.
There are going to be others that try to disentangle and list, I think.
Yeah. I think that the trickier thing there, well, I guess Trulieve actually sold the assets, and actually took they took a paper loss on it. If you looked at the financial pro forma financials. But yeah, I mean, it's possible that GTI uses that vehicle for it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting sort of question.
There's a lot of questions, obviously, but I think to your point, Mark, this is a net good for the industry that a stock exchange in New York is taking a cannabis company based in the U.S., even if it's just a medical assets, a relatively big company, as you just said, of the balance sheet. Like it's really something, and it happened quick.
Yeah.
And I wonder, not to read, as I mentioned to Jeremy earlier, like the tea leaves, like there must have been some conversations happening like this with the exchanges.
Yeah.
Why that we see sort of a it's not a reverse split, I guess, of stocks. It's why we see companies getting their shit together. It's probably a lot of balance sheets that are like trying to separate everything and how would that, operationalize that. Like if this, the other question is like, who is big enough to do this to then also meet the requirements of the exchanges to not fall flat?
Right. Well, that's my point. Is that my point earlier? Same thing, that there aren't that many companies that can effectively meet those standards and pull this off. But for the ones that can, it's there's a lot of upside.
Yeah.
So
a lot of upside. Can we shift for a second, because we came to the end of several legislative sessions this week in our next thing, which I'm calling States' Rights and Wrongs. It's a play on words, right? States' rights, and some of them got
we got it. We got. You don't need to explain.
I feel like I do for some people in our audience. It's pretty late in the day on the East Coast for some of our audience. Illinois passed some new regulations in an omnibus bill around the security regulations around dispensaries, around purchase limits, around some other operational items in the state. So good. Minnesota passed some rules that are not good, consolidating some things. Kentucky as well, new indications covered in the medical program. That's all counterbalanced in some ways by Pennsylvania and Virginia doing nothing this legislative. Well, Virginia doing the opposite of what it should have done in the legislative session. New York, we talked about last week, and have funds in an anti-inversion bill that was this week, but also funds to help people with their tags for metric. Like there was a lot of movement in a relatively short amount of time, which happens at the end of legislative sessions. But I also wonder, and this is the question, is this the federal government's actions pushing the states to do more or something, because the industry is lining up slightly differently than the states have set up for? Either one of you.
I mean, I don't think so, because you had the state of California put out a press release about 2 weeks ago saying, we recognize that this happened at the federal level and we're trying to figure out what to do about it.
Right.
I think a lot of this week's moves are sort of unrelated, just because they don't really, they're dealing with different issues.
Some are dealing with them.
My guess it's more just luck of timing rather than anything. But again, I could be wrong.
I think there's also some reporting. I actually am blanking on which state it was, but it was one of the regulators in Colorado or California who had a quote and saying, like, we're waiting, for guidance from the federal government about what this means. And I thought that was an interesting quote, because they really just don't have guidance, and they are literally, building the plane as they fly it right now. All these state programs could change, immensely in a month, right? And they need some insight from, what Congress wants to do, how the FDA wants to treat this, and we have none of that yet. Hopefully that's forthcoming, but I think it makes their jobs extremely challenging in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, I'm going to switch gears one more time, because Jeremy. No, go ahead, Mark.
I just want to mention, CANRA, the Cannabis Regulators Association, has their big meeting next week. So I suspect that this will all be the only thing they're talking about.
I've never had more people ask me if I'm going to a CANRA event. I was like, nope. I try to go to fun cannabis events. Just kidding, CANRA people.
CANRA's fun. Hey, yeah.
It's definitely not. Speaking of not fun, Jeremy, you are in an ongoing battle with newspapers based in New York. This week it was the New York Times again. What is the burr in your spur? What is it? The burr in your
raspberry senior Whitson. What grinds your gears?
What grinds your gears?
I think those are aphorisms for 50 plus. So I'll move on past that.
Do you know this one? Is this an aphorism you're familiar with?
What's the raspberry seed in your wisdom tooth?
A couple things going on here, right? I want to sort of take my particular concerns with the recent editorial aside and sort of broaden the conversation a little bit, right? So the New York Times has been writing about cannabis and what they see sort of as the public health harms of cannabis now for about a year, right? A lot of their stories, besides Ashley Southall, who writes about the industry very, very well, and I want to sort of get that out there. A lot of their stories from non-Ashley reporters and from the editorial board are about sort of curbing the industry, promoting public health, and all the sort of ills and evils they see with rising easy access to cannabis use, right? Point taken, it is a drug and there are externalities associated with legalization. We should be clear-eyed about that as an industry. At the same time, I believe the New York Times editorial board, specifically the writer German Lopez, who's normally pretty good on the drug policy beat, elides very simple Econ 101 arguments about demand elasticity. And he said in a recent editorial posted on Monday, they should raise taxes on cannabis, they should make it harder to purchase, et cetera, right? To me, anyone who has taken an econ class knows that when there are substitutes, raising the price does not actually drive the behavior that policymakers want. Meaning, if you raise cannabis taxes, you make legal cannabis more expensive, well, there's a well-oiled illicit market that will not charge you taxes and that will undercut the legal market very quickly. And so what is the greater good here, right? Is it more people buying cannabis legally, or is it less people using cannabis? I think, regulators need to really understand these questions and measure policies based on those questions, because those two things are in opposition, right? The economic growth of the industry needs consumers purchasing cannabis. It needs to be cheaper, or at least of equal price to what they can get on the illicit market. Overall, I thought it was a little bit disappointing that, a venerable paper like the New York Times can sort of hand wave away pretty easy arguments to make. I wrote that in the newsletter today. And I think one of the classic examples of that, right, is Michigan. They levied a 24% wholesale tax on cannabis. They said, let me just pull up the numbers here.
States were down.
Yeah, they predicted $105 million of quarterly revenue from that. It brought in 34 million, right? So there's your data point. It doesn't work. Obviously, cannabis should be taxed. You need to fund things. These taxes can go to good things, like Albuquerque is using cannabis taxes for universal basic income. That's a story that broke today. At the same time, policymakers, economists, whoever it may be, even cannabis newsletter writers can probably figure out what the tax rate might be that's more effective, that brings people into the legal market, that raises tax revenue, that undercuts the illicit market. Disappointing to see that from the New York Times. The last thing I'll say about this is, this idea we've sort of gotten at in the newsletter over the past couple months is that, the industry is really leading the advocacy fight for cannabis. And I'm a journalist. I've been in mainstream newsrooms. Like, journalists would love to take down the next big tobacco. And so that is kind of the frame they're thinking about this through, rightfully or wrongfully, that they're these big, well-capitalized public companies that are buddy-buddy with the Trump administration, and they're sort of spreading an addictive product around the country into low-income neighborhoods, et cetera. Like, that's catnip for journalists. It's not entirely true, but there's enough truth to it, right, that story will keep getting written, and the industry needs to understand that.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, that's a good point, because there is a lot of perception outside of the industry, and to a certain extent within the industry, that all of this is being fueled by tobacco and pharma money, which is,
the stocks would be higher if that was true.
Yeah, the best indications are that's completely wrong. It's and so, but there is a big perception in that regard. So that makes sense.
There are major investments from tobacco companies in cannabis companies, and they're not doing in the same place as everybody else.
They're writing it down. I mean,
and in Europe, it's not in the US though.
But it's in Canada.
Yeah, and I would say, there is, I'm loath to give them credit, but Smart Approaches to Marijuana has really pushed this narrative, and to a degree of success that I think outpaces what they deserve as an organization. But I would just caution my fellow reporters to understand that that's a narrative that's created that isn't necessarily reflected in the data, both in terms of public health research as well as the business side, right? I think if you peel back the curtain a little bit, the narrative starts to unfold relatively quickly.
All right, friends, we're going to get to our favorite segment. So, winners and losers, aside from the winners, whoever sold white shirts to all of us on the same day, that's like big winner there. I guess the bleach manufacturers really happy today since we are representing the clean white shirts. Mark, your winner or loser for the week, or maybe both?
Well, I'm definitely the loser because earlier this week I wrote and said that that uplisting was going to take a while, and I was totally wrong about that. So so I definitely lost there. But yeah, I mean, I think the clear winner this week is Trulieve. They made a different, they lost their earlier bet but won the bigger bet. So
yep. Jeremy Burke.
It's easy.
Yeah, obviously Kim Rivers at Trulieve, like credit to her for navigating this process, taking a big at bat in Florida, but getting this one, getting almost what might be a home run or maybe a third with this one. Another winner I would say is the New York State Assembly. I know I used this last week, but they are actively passing and evaluating effective cannabis like regulation that the industry wants. The anti-inversion bill passed the Senate this week. The governor did not sign it yet. I messed that up in the newsletter. Sorry, everyone. But the governor is likely to sign it very soon. And the Knicks. Come on.
That's like well, any team from New York is basically unlikable, but the Spurs are so likable that we're going with that.
I know, but so is Jalen Brunson. Come on.
Fair enough. Okay, I have a winner and a loser, but on the same story, and that is about Andrew Left, famous short seller. Is that even the right term, Jeremy? You're gonna tell me.
Infamous, I think.
Infamous. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
So he was on trial. He was found guilty. I think it was 13 counts, and faces actual jail time in federal court for manipulating retail investors, basically, by publishing and then taking positions that were contrary to what he was saying publicly. That's at least my bad take on what was. So he's the loser. Andrew Left is the loser. But in the story, the reporting out of the story, Mike Gorenstein, who is a frequent contributor on our platform, is the CEO of Kronos Group, actually testified in the case. So he's my winner. I guess he testified, and his side won, or the prosecutors won. Andrew Left is a loser because he sounds like an asshole, and he. And part of the discovery was that he had, in an internal email to a friend, I guess, said that something like this: manipulating the investors that follow him was like taking candy from a baby. I think was the quote, which is a real fucked up thing to say. But he will find out in federal prison likely how fun that can be. Those are my winners. Yes, Mark.
George Archos from Verano.
Big week.
Who terminated his employment agreements and paid him $2.5 million of a bonus, like 0.7% of the float in option or equity incentive, and up to his salary. I think that was the third part is correct.
By 40%. I looked at it. Yeah,
but,
almost.
But he's still in the same position, and it's still unclear why his contract was terminated. So, but that's, he got a nice little economic bump from the company. So he can
buy all the white shirts he wants now.
Yeah. Yeah. So if anybody who's watching this has any information as to why that happened, please let us know, because we're all very curious.
Fair enough. Jeremy and Mark, thank you for making time today for This Week in Cannabis Live. It was a busy week and a big week. And next week, we're actually, Jeremy and I are going to do this from the Canadian Securities Exchange. So we'll talk about some of those things from an actual exchange that has cannabis companies on it. And maybe by this time next week, there'll be other companies that have announced listing in New York. Who knows? It'll probably be such a boring week. We'll have nothing to talk about, and we'll all wear different color shirts. Deal?
I'm sticking with white.
Okay.
That's good.
White's good. Yeah. All right, Mark, Jeremy, thanks for being here. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We'll be back next week. Find us at Cultivated.news. Find Mark at Cannabis Musings. You can find that on a Substack. It's awesome. All right, everybody, have a good weekend.
Thanks a lot.